And we can get started. Certainly glad to see so many people here and online. Should be an interesting meeting. My name is Mike Cerrone. I'm the president, and we have a whole crew of people here making this happen. So we're going to start our agenda today. We're going to start with a few announcements, and then Martin will do a recap of the November election, and then we'll get into a longer discussion about the next steps for the club. For announcements, let's see, can we get a microphone to Gail to talk about our next meeting, which is our holiday party?
Hello, everybody. You hear me? Hi. You hear me? Hi, you hear me? Hear me now? Okay, hi. It's Gail here. Hello. Okay, so we finally found a place. It's like a miracle of miracles. A lot of the places are now charging like $6,000 to book a room, so that's kind of nuts. But we're meeting at the AC Hotel. It's not air conditioning hotel. It's just AC hotel. It's on the corner of Fair Oaks and El Camino. You'll get more stuff. And on Wednesday, a bunch of us are going to go over there and try their food and figure out exactly where we can meet because they have a really nice bar area. And the nice thing is we're scratching their back because December has low occupancy in Sunnyvale. So everybody come. We'll have some food and there'll be an open bar. Oh, 2 to 4. 2 to 4 p.m. on December 13th, which is a Saturday.
All right. Thank you, Gail. It's always a challenge finding venues for meetings like this. In Sunnyvale, they don't cost an arm and a leg. Following up on the last election, we have our endorsed candidate for assessor. Nisa is here, and
thank you. And I'm really just here to say thank you. Well, I came in with the main purpose of just saying thank you to the SunnyvaleDems for one, giving me your sole endorsement, but not only endorsing, like I'll say some other groups may do, you guys showed up for me. I know at the farmer's market, I know you guys walked, I know you made phone calls, and I know I would not be the top vote getter on November 4th had it not been for your support. As you know, there are a lot of voters in Sunnyvale, and when we are breaking down the numbers, it showed that Sunnyvale showed up, and I know you guys had a lot to do with that. So thank you, thank you, thank you. This means a lot. A lot of people didn't think it would happen, but it has happened. At least I'm one step closer. And that's the second reason why I'm here after walking through the door and realizing that a few of you didn't realize that the election isn't over. So I was the top vote getter on November 4th. Unfortunately, I didn't get over 50%. No candidate did. And because of that, we do have a runoff on December 30th. So I'm going to need you to show up for me again, especially because we realize a lot of people don't know there is a runoff election on December 30th. Ballots will go out on December 8th. And so we're encouraging folks to vote early, tell their friends, family members, and neighbors to vote early. One, it's always better to vote early, but two, we have the holidays. And so people will be leaving. I won't be leaving. I joked with someone earlier today that all my holidays are canceled, right? Christmas is canceled. Everything that I normally celebrate around the holidays, canceled for me. Obviously, voters will not cancel their vacation and holidays for me, but what I do want them to do, and your help getting them to do it, is to please vote before they go on vacation and go on their holidays or start their celebrations. So thank you again. Thanks for your sole endorsement. We have 6.5 more weeks to go. We can do it. And I don't have to convince this group, because I already spoke to you and you have solely endorsed me, that I am really the best qualified candidate for this position in order to ensure that the assessor's office continues to serve you, the residents of Santa Clara County. And I'm excited. I look forward to being your assessor. But for that to happen, I'm going to need your help. So thank you again, and let's vote and let's get it done on December 30th. Thank you. And happy holidays in advance. And then I see Linda Sell, who has been amazing. Let me give the mic to Linda. Couldn't have done it without her.
I just wanted to say that our club has endorsed the winner of the primary election, but she can't win without our continued help. So we gave her the sole endorsement. So I have a sign up list going around. And if you want to do any of the things on the sign up list, then put your name down in it or come talk to me afterwards. So thank you. I'm speaking in my personal capacity.
Add one more thing, and I see Guy's hand. Not because I was the top vote getter means I'm going to win on December 30th. And I want to emphasize that. We are not taking my opponent for granted. We're not underestimating his ability to win on December 30th. He has run for 3 or 4 other offices. He didn't win. So we know he really wants to win something, whether or not he's qualified or not. And so he will be doing everything he can, and so will his supporters. So we really need our supporters to show up, because this will not be an easy race. It's a reset for the runoff. Even though I was the top vote getter, it really will come down to whose supporters show up, right? So we really need our supporters to show up to win on December 30th. So thank you, Guy.
Guy Johnson, local 1702, Southwest Airlines, San Jose Airport. So your opponent is stating that they can easily get certified, and they're making it sound like a super easy job. Can you clarify for us, if we do have that conversation, how do we rebuke that, or how do we address that with people who are saying, well, he can easily get this certification?
Oh. So thanks for that question, Guy. Testing. So before I answer Guy's question, I want to step back and just make it clear that my opponent is not qualified for multiple reasons. One is he doesn't have the property tax certification that Guy mentioned, and I'll elaborate on that after I make a couple other points. 2, he also doesn't have the professional experience working in the assessor's office. And working in the assessor's office is specialized technical work that I have. I was the attorney for the office years ago, came back as part of the executive management team. So I know the work, I'm doing the work, and I have the qualifications and professional experience to do the work. A matter of fact, when you look at the platform and the things he's promising in his campaign, it demonstrates he doesn't understand the role of the assessor and what an assessor can actually do. Specifically with regards to the property tax certification, this is a state legal requirement for California assessors to have. Yes, you can get it. Let's assume someone who runs to be assessor wins and doesn't have the property tax certification. He or she is able to get that certification between 30 days after being elected and up to a year. But the reason, so a couple of things, the reason why I highlight that as something I already have is because for this important office, and being in a county where we have a budget crisis, where the cities, schools, the county, and so many other jurisdictions are dependent on the work we do in the office, we need someone who knows the work already and will be ready on day 1 to hit the ground running and to serve you. And I have that property tax certification. So I check all those boxes. I know the work, I have the experience, I have the qualifications. And it is not an easy exam. As someone who took the California bar exam, thankfully passed the first time, I had to really study for this exam. It's a comprehensive exam that requires understanding business, personal property, commercial, residential, how we value and apply laws to different properties here in Santa Clara County. So it's complex. And so even though someone may say, I get elected, I can take it, not that easy. But two, we cannot afford to risk having someone who doesn't have that qualification, and in addition to that, doesn't have the professional experience or even understand what we do in the assessor's office to be leading this important office for Santa Clara County.
I got a text this morning from Rishi, so his name Rishi, whatever his name is, and Rishi, and he promises, because I'm a senior, he promises that I will have no more property taxes. And then he went on to say, I'm going to push for a petition that seniors don't have property tax. Before it had sounded like he had the ability to get rid of the property tax. This time he said, I'm going to push for it. It was a very persuasive text. And unfortunately, I deleted it and sent it to junk. Otherwise, I would show it to you. But it was very persuasive. And I can't figure out why he won second. And I think it's because he hit up a bunch of seniors who, I don't know, what is your comment on that?
Thanks, Margaret. And you're right. We're still breaking down the numbers from the results, and he did well. He came in second. And so he's in the runoff with me. And one of the things he was saying during the special election, which wasn't true, and it was pandering and preying on our seniors, was that he was going to exempt seniors from property taxes, from paying property taxes. He couldn't have done that. He said that. He said he would do it. We have documented proof that's what he was saying. And so now it sounds like his position is evolving. But even this new position he's trying to take on the issue, it's not that easy, right? And it shows his limited understanding or no understanding of the complexities of property tax law in California. In order to change the property tax infrastructure, which unlike other states, so there's some states, I think 16 states that actually have an exemption for seniors. But those states had set up their tax infrastructure where they weren't heavily dependent on property taxes. In California, our tax structure is completely different. All 58 counties are dependent on property taxes because that's how our tax infrastructure was set up. Every year being in the assessor's office, we have, some resident, not necessarily in our county, wanting to say, can we increase the homeowner's exemption? And that dies on arrival, right? No one is touching changes to the property tax infrastructure that we have here in California. And so again, it's misleading, it's pandering to even give the impression that he will be able to make this change statewide, right? Again, we have 57 other counties, and I have other assessors in these counties saying no way, right? And this is someone, I'll just say, he was on Saratoga City Council, and he couldn't convince 2 of his council members to make him mayor. He was passed over twice. He was never mayor of his city. And so if he can't convince 2 of his colleagues on council to make him mayor, I don't see how he's going to have success convincing an entire state to change something that our system is fundamentally dependent on. What's our strategy? Linda, what's our strategy? So it's not going to be easy, right? Again, we're not underestimating him, and the county is large. People are distracted. A lot of people think it's over. We have the holidays, so we have a lot of challenges. It's about education, making sure every opportunity we get, we dispel the misinformation that's out there. A lot of this will require money, and for the next couple of weeks before we actually start doing voter outreach and engagement, we're focused on fundraising, right? This runoff is going to cost each campaign at least $300,000 because we have to reach voters to ensure, one, they understand that there's still an election, what's involved, who the candidates are, and why they should vote for you as a candidate. And through mailers, digital ads, social media, and the list goes on because it's a large county. We can't just take one approach. We have to do a multi-prong approach in order to reach voters and get their attention and make sure they vote for us. It's going to cost a lot of money. So our strategy, the message will be the same. Our message obviously resonated in the special, so we're not changing from that message, which is I'm the most qualified, experienced, ready to go candidate to serve the residents of Santa Clara County, because that's what the assessor's office requires and that's what you deserve. The strategy is reaching as many voters as possible, hold my 37% and expanding that so that we get past the 50% threshold. And to do that, we need funds.
Hi, my name's Trent. How or what's your strategy for getting those funds for the rest of the campaign?
We're always open to suggestions because it is not easy raising that much money. For the special election, we got close to that. And a lot of it, fortunately, was from individual donors. So I am on Los Altos City Council. I'm in my second term. I'm vice mayor. And so hi, Emily. A lot of my supporters in Los Altos and the surrounding communities who have known me as a regional leader donated. A lot of my supporters also reached out to their endorsers and their donors and had them donate. So majority of my donations came from individual supporters or endorsers, and organizations also donated. And the unfortunate thing is, regardless if you're a group, organization, or individual, the same $1,000 cap applies to everyone. So even if an organization or an individual is able to give more than 1,000, they're not able to. So it's capped at 1,000. So it's, and it doesn't matter if it's $1 or $1,000, we accept all donations. Thank you. Yes. And you can go to, we have our own software that we use for the campaign, but publicly available on the ROV, the Register of Voters website. You can go to the map and click in, and it'll show all the votes, the different precincts, your cities, and you can see how the votes broke down. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Nisa. And we do have a couple of yard signs here, if somebody wants to take one. But we're saying don't put them out, I guess, until December 8th when the ballots go out. But there's a couple of yard signs. Yep. All right, well, let me acknowledge the elected officials and dignitaries here on the call. And then Charlene has an announcement. So we heard from Vice Mayor Linda Sell, Councilmember, Sunnyvale Councilmember Murli Srinivasan is on. We have Emily Ramos from the Mountain View City Council, or Vice Mayor of Mountain View, who is actually a former board member of the club, which some people don't know that, but she's. And we have, let's see, Scott Duncan from the Sunnyvale HHS Commission, Martin Pyne from the Planning Commission, Agnes Veith from the Chair of the Arts Commission, and of course, our own Crystal Wickham, who's on the County Sustainability Commission. And who did I miss? Oh, and Carter, who from the Library Board of Trustees. All right, and so go ahead, Charlene.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Charlene Liu. I'm a director at large of this club. I just wanted to announce that the Sunnyvale Council will be making a decision on Hollenbeck bike lanes on December 2nd at the December 2nd meeting. And the agenda item will begin close to 7 p.m. So I encourage those who are interested in making our streets safe for biking to attend and present your experience, how your experience will change based on having bike lanes or not. Currently, Hollenbeck does not have bike lanes. It's a major north-south corridor in South Sunnyvale, and it will connect people from Cupertino all the way through Civic Center, downtown, and Moffett Park. And so there are two options being considered. There is buffered bike lanes, which is a space buffered followed by a standard width bike lane, and the removal of parking, which will then allow visibility for all road users. And then there's another option, which is substandard, and it's not safe. And it retains parking on one side of the street, that's squeezing the bike lane, so it's narrower. And then the bike lane doesn't have a buffer to buffer you from the moving cars, and it doesn't have a buffer to buffer you from the parked cars, which might open their doors into your face. So those are the options being considered, and I hope you will attend and voice your opinion on December 2nd. Thanks.
Thanks, Charlene. So now I think we can move to the next item. Martin, I know you're here somewhere. You can give us a recap of the last election. Mercifully, it was locally, it was only 3 items compared to some years, but
Yeah. So you already kind of heard the top line. Well, there were 3 items on the there were 3 items on our ballots. There was, as we've discussed already, the assessor election, which our endorsed candidate Nasa got 37.7%. Rishi Kumar got 24%. Yenzo got 21%. Brian Joe got 17%. And that, as we've discussed, that needed a 50% to avoid a very off-cycle, off-time runoff. You are not going to be able to see this, but as mentioned, there's a map. You can just pull up the map on the Register of Voters website, and I encourage you to do that instead of trying to see what my phone looks like on the from there. We also had Measure A, which was the sales tax measure. That one passed with 57.25% of the vote, so that just needed 50%, so that has passed. Proposition, the other big item on the California ballot was Proposition 50. That passed overwhelmingly. It got 71.5% in Santa Clara County, which is actually exceeds the presidential margin in Santa Clara County at the last cycle. Statewide, as of now, these numbers probably will shift a little before it's certified, but they should be pretty close. As of now, it has a 64.4% margin statewide. So that was the local results. There were a number of other elections around the country. Probably the biggest would be the Virginia, New Jersey governor's races. Democrats held the New Jersey race and picked up the Virginia governor's. I'll do this by state. Virginia Democrats picked up all 3 statewide elections: governor, lieutenant governor, and by lesser but still actually pretty large margin, actually better than Harris's margin, attorney general, because the attorney general candidate had a minor scandal regarding some ill-advised text messages he sent, but he still won by like 6 points, so it didn't. And so it mattered because he won by less than the other candidates, but he still won. Democrats also picked up 13 seats in the state assembly, so which is their largest margin in since Democrats had started having good opinions on Virginia Democrats started having good opinions on civil rights laws. So also New Jersey, Mickey Sherrill won the governor's race there by honestly a similar margin to Spamberger in New Jersey. Weren't any New Jersey does not have other statewide electeds. They don't even have, which has actually had caused interesting things to happen in the past because they used to not even have a lieutenant governor, so you'd have goofy things happen when it was. But anyway, that's has nothing to do with the election. They also picked up a couple seats in their state legislature. Lots of other things happened, and there were a lot of just other local elections. There were some interesting mayoral results in New York, in Minneapolis, and Seattle. I'm not sure what any of those tell us nationally because there are a lot of local concerns in all of those races. But there were all kinds of weird local and all kinds of local stuff. There was a recall election up in Marin County because people were mad at, I think it was at their city councilors for approving more housing, and that recall got defeated, so that was good. There's a ballot measure in Sausalito there was a pro-housing ballot measure in Sausalito that passed. Like there's a lot of stuff, but I think that covers the kind of the big stuff both here and nationally. Well, New York is weird because it's genuinely weird because you have the Democratic nominee versus the sex pest former governor who lost the nomination and is running in as an independent versus the Republican who's the random gadfly Republican that runs every time and has no chance. Like, I think it's an interesting race. I don't know how you extrapolate for that with that for literally anything else because I hope there aren't any other Andrew Cuomo's running anywhere. In Seattle, there was a Dem race where the progressive challenger unseated the more moderate incumbent. Then Minneapolis, there was a Dem general race where the more moderate, and again, I don't follow politics in these cities that closely, so this is just the high level description about where the more moderate incumbent defeated the more progressive challenger in that race. So I don't know what any of this means nationally, honestly, because you look at all those data points and I don't really see a clear picture. New York, I know why the New York race has gotten a lot of coverage, but I think there are so many weird local factors about New York. I just don't know how it generalizes to anywhere else, but we'll see.
I've heard a lot about Democrats winning in the last election. Were there any significant races where Republicans actually won?
I'd have to go poking. I have to go poking pretty far down ballot is the answer. Like there were, I'm sure there was. I'm pretty sure there was something somewhere, but like unless we're talking about like Democrats didn't win all of the state assembly races in Virginia that were up. So, but like beyond that, but like it was broadly speaking a good night for Democrats across the board. I'd have to drill down into there were Pennsylvania. The other big one was the Pennsylvania had state Supreme Court elections for 3 state Supreme Court seats, and Democrats won all 3 of those, and so Republicans can't take a majority on that state Supreme Court until like 2030 or something.
Hi there. My question was regarding, so there was a lot of good news, I feel like, is what we're hearing right now at the ballots. But something that I was concerned about and wanted to hear from this club and leadership on was what exactly, are we thinking regarding the end of the shutdown? Specifically, the 8 Democrats, 7 Democrats, I think 1 independent that voted to end that shutdown and return for essentially nothing when it comes to the ACA subsidies that I think are so important to many people in our community and around the country. So I don't know, I was hoping to hear from leadership on that and you as well. So thank you, or perhaps even get some discussion from members.
I mean, my personal opinion on the Senate is that the next Democratic Congress should grant the District of Columbia approximately 120 states, and then we pass constitutional amendments fixing the dang thing. That's probably not likely, but it is technically possible. The problem I always have with the Senate is that as Californians, we basically don't have an equal voice in the Senate again versus, and I think it would be nice if we had better Democrats in the Senate regarding well, a lot of things. But I also think it's going to be, for better or worse, up to the Democrats in the various states that have questionable, where the senators are making bad votes, to identify candidates, and if they're putting up primary challenges, to identify candidates that would make strong primary challengers and get them out of line. Obviously, obviously you can donate across state lines. Like when at such time as such candidates were to emerge, that would happen. It's kind of hard for me from a California perspective to just say, here's what we should do about these senators from the other side of the country, because I don't know what they're going. I'm not sure how much we can do about that. Like if Schiff or Padilla had voted to reopen the government, I'd be taking a different tack on this. But it's just the Senate just frustrates me, because as a Californian, we have so much comparatively less voting power than any other state in the country. Which
So,
I know that I'm kind of equivocating here, but like ultimately, like the other problem is there's the cost benefit problem, which is that like it does depend on the state. Like Joe Manchin was infinitely frustrating for a lot of reasons, but Joe Manchin was still a much better Virginia. But I'd still much rather have Joe Manchin in West Virginia than Jim Justice in West Virginia, because Jim Justice votes with has exactly 0% good votes, and so there is the balance of, do you have the a moderate senator that can get elected in a comparatively red state versus a not. But that's I think something that people in various state Democratic parties would probably have a better touch in than me, kind of sitting here in California being like, why do you not have all California style senators? And ultimately the Senate map does skew currently more Republican than it does Democratic, especially if you look at what's up next election cycle, but we'll see.
So I hope we can answer all of those questions in the next discussion here. In fact, I'm thinking we can leave today having solved all the problems of the Democratic Party collectively, and we can text that our conclusions when we finish the meeting. So I'm looking forward to that. So, all right, thanks, Martin. And now let me introduce Alexander. Yeah, yes. And one or both of those mics should work. So, I'll just, I think we all know Alexander, but nevertheless, somebody may have just dropped in from out of town. I don't know. He represents Central Sunnyvale on the Foothill Anza Board of Trustees. In his day job, he serves as Chief of Staff for San Jose Councilmember Anthony Tordillos, and who just kicked off his reelection campaign. I saw in the spotlight, and is a faculty member in at San Jose University's Political Science Department, which is, in a way, the main expertise, that applies to our discussion here, where he specializes in security policy, democratization, and U.S. politics. He's a first-generation American, son of refugees, and lives in the Heritage District in Sunnyvale. So what we're going to do here, and maybe you want to say a few words first, but go ahead. Then we're going to go. I have a few slides that I'm going to go through very quickly just to kind of set the context a little bit. But we're not going to dwell on them because we're not pushing a particular position, or just it kind of throws out some of the things that people are talking about.
I appreciate the very kind introduction. I'll just say that I'm looking forward to the discussion, and based on some of the questions I've already gotten, for example, from some of the folks here today, I'm excited, not just for the conversation that we're going to have, but also hopefully some time to get some questions from the audience and have it be less of a Q&A and more of a conversation around where we see the Democratic Party going and where we want to see it going. So looking forward to it.
Okay, and now I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Always exciting. Here. Okay. It's a miracle. All right, so let me quickly go through this again. Just to summarize sorry, I'm all the controls here are blocking my view of the screen. So, okay, this is just summarizes some of the trends at a top level of the 2024 election. And if you look down at the bottom, is that my eyes or is this blurred? Okay. At any rate, I mean, the bottom line is that interestingly, between 1916 and 1924 elections, that's good. That's good. The white vote has been almost exactly the same. I don't know what that tells us, but particularly to some extent, Black and Hispanic and Asian have swung pretty dramatically towards, really in this case, towards Trump. So something to keep in mind. The politically disengaged voters became much more Republican. So in 2024, people who voted for who had voted for Biden and who voted in 2020 favored Biden by +2%. People who did not vote in 2020 favored Trump by 14%. So this is something that was counterintuitive to me, because after the 24 election, I was telling people Democrats just didn't show up. We lost the election. But in fact, if more people had voted in 2024, Trump would have won by an even greater margin. And I mean, it makes sense because his strongest appeal is to kind of, uninformed, disengaged voters. Basically, the more you look at news or the higher educated you are, the more you're likely to favor Democratic policies because Democrats have policies. So immigrant voters nationwide, immigrant voters swung from +27 for Biden to +1 for Trump. And which again seems kind of crazy if you look at what the policies are. But my speculation would be that um, immigrant voters, like everybody else, have a problem with high rent, high groceries, all of that. So, and Trump had a story to tell. We now know it was a complete lie, but he did have a story to tell. And the gender gap is also a big deal, particularly for people under 25. The gender gap doubled. In general, young men were attracted to Trump, and young women who want, some sort of rights went towards the Democrats. The youth vote, not sure why you can't see that, but anyway, the youth vote in the most recent election, a lot of people came out, which I think surprised everybody because in an off-year elections like this, you don't get much participation from anybody. So that was very significant, and in California for Prop 50. This table kind of tells it all. This is comparing cost of living inflation to many other issues, and in every case, overwhelmingly voters think cost of living inflation is more important than any of the rest of these issues. The environment, abortion, race relations, LGBTQ issues. So something to keep in mind. And Martin already talked about what happened in New Jersey and Virginia and New York. All three candidates focused on affordability, but that means different things in each state. And he's a Democratic Socialist, and in Virginia and New Jersey, they're much more mainstream candidates, but they had that in common. So just to quickly throw out a couple of phrases I won't attempt to explain the abundance agenda, but I recommend reading the book and some other books. So this has been widely discussed as a way forward for the Democratic Party. And, the gist of it is that Democrats have become sort of they call it a vetocracy, that there are too many special interest groups. Any of those groups can stop anything from happening. So basically nothing happens, which is why we haven't been able to build high-speed rail in California. In China, they've built 30,000 miles of high-speed rail. And we have, we don't have any really yet. We have some construction on the way. But that's the thrust of that. So that may be something we want to discuss. And I just want to introduce two words that have come up also in this context. Less educated Americans differentially demand pre-distribution policies, meaning essentially find some way for people to make a better living, right? Federal jobs guarantees, higher minimum wage, protectionism, and stronger unions. While more educated Americans differentially favor redistribution, taxes and transfers, and the title of this particular paper is Compensating the Losers. So I think that's definitely something to think about as we discuss this. Pre-distribution and redistribution. So, and I'm not going to go through this because I think we kind of know the answer, but it's many things. And, honestly, we can be very annoying. As one person said, we annoyed half the country into supporting fascism. It's partly because being more educated results in more, you're more particular about things, right? Like maybe Pete's coffee is terrible, and another coffee pick your coffee, is great. And oh my God, I wouldn't touch that. And that's a kind of sort of arrogance that we have. And arrogant, rightly so, because we're so well educated and know so much. We should be arrogant, but you need to know when to exhibit that. So these are some things people have thrown out, and we could just talk about. One is rebuilding the working class coalition, right? Everybody says that we lost the working class. Where did they go? Working class, typically defined as often defined as people without a college education. So you could argue that, well, certainly we're not going to appeal to working class with our 20-point complicated programs, right? And also, there's been a lot of written on the Dem Club book group. We did a lot of discussion about this, but progressive versus moderate, resolve the internal divide, progressive versus moderate. Do we have to pick one and go with that, or do we have to give more moderate? New messaging, which we certainly saw in this last election, right? Plain language, centered on affordability, and those candidates focused on affordability like a laser. They didn't bring up every possible thing, right? Do we need a generational shift in leadership? And strengthen the party infrastructure. When Howard Dean was running the party, he had a 50-state strategy. And we've gotten away from that. We focus on the swing states, and maybe that's not the best plan. So, and a fundamental question here is the future of the Democratic Party, a multiracial working class coalition, focus on economic transformation, or a college-educated, culturally progressive coalition focused on rights and institutions. And before I ask Alexander to comment, I'll just say, as I listen to our leaders talk, I feel like I'm hearing slogans that were focus grouped in the 50s. It's like their target audience is mom and pop kettle, and that that is kind of the approach we take. But we are largely a college-educated, culturally progressive. So it's like we're saying nothing to our base. And on the other hand, we're talking to people who don't want to hear what we have to say, which is not a strategy for winning. So before we get to questions, Carol, I see you have a question, but well, let's get into that. Alexander, do you have any?
Okay, well, there's a few different places we can start here. I'm going to start with this question and then tie in perhaps Carol's question here.
Yeah.
And my sense is we often pit these as dichotomies against each other. So like abundance versus populism, moderate versus progressive, a multiracial working class coalition focused on economic transformation versus a college-educated, culturally progressive coalition focused on rights. And I want to argue that to some extent, that dichotomy is kind of fictitious. For one, both from a policy perspective and a messaging perspective. Can you have economic transformation that doesn't focus on rights, that doesn't focus on the differences in different identities in American society, right? The most successful economic transformations that we've had in this country, FDR's New Deal, LBJ's Great Society, were packages of legislation that recognized that poverty, that generational poverty, don't impact the working class the same across the board, right? It impacts the white working class differently than Black Americans, than Hispanic Americans, than women who are working class. And so both those leaders, both those plans recognize that you can't have economic transformation without accounting for what we now sometimes call cultural differences or culturally progressive viewpoints. And so I kind of want to make that argument. We can talk about abundance versus populism as well, because I know it's a big debate within the party right now. But I just want to, that's kind of going to be my approach here, is to argue that in a lot of ways, these dichotomies that we construct around this are pretty fictitious. And I think these 2025 elections actually illustrate that pretty well. Because to your point, all three of these sort of big candidates, right? Spanberger in Virginia, Mikey Sherrill in New Jersey, Mamdani in New York, we're focused on affordability, but not just on affordability, but also bold solutions on affordability, right? A lot of people know Mamdani's big thing was freeze the rent, right? That was a big part of his platform. And free buses, yeah. Meanwhile, here we're just like, can we just get buses? But Mikey Sherrill was also the candidate for governor of New Jersey, calling for freezes on utility increases, right? Freezes on the cost of electricity, on the cost of gas in New Jersey. And this is someone who's often, you know, framed as the moderate in contrast to Mamdani's progressive. So I don't think the distinction is necessarily progressive versus moderate. I think it's often who is not just speaking to the issues that people care about or that they're facing, but also who is proposing bold solutions that capture the imagination of voters as things that can actually tackle the fundamental causes of what they're feeling, right? You're feeling crunched by high prices, you're feeling crunched by affordability. Mamdani says, well, what's the biggest thing you're paying for month to month? And for a lot of folks, it's going to be your rent. Mikey Sherrill says, well, what's one of the biggest things you're paying for? It's probably your utility bill, your electricity, your gas costs, the things that have risen the most. So that's just kind of a starting position that I'm going to come from here, and happy to talk more about that.
So yeah, in terms of the moderate, you know, do we need to be more moderate or whatever? And even the fact that Mamdani is a, you know, a democratic socialist, I feel like how many people really are looking at policy in any kind of depth? I think it's a very small percentage. And if, you know, there are many things that, you know, that I consider important and we all consider important, but if as a candidate you have a 15-minute window or a debate or whatever, you have to pick and choose what you're talking about first, right? And so I really feel like people don't care so much, you know, moderate or progressive, but it's what is communicated, right? What is important, and by communicating these basic issues to people. And, you know, can he make transportation free? I don't know, but at least, you know, tell me you love me. At least let's, you know, say this is what we want, rather than lead with reasons why we can't get it. And I guess, you know, that's my feeling. I always say if 80% of the time, if you're talking as a politician, right, talking to people, 80% of the time you should be talking about things that affect or benefit 80% of the people. And I feel like Democrats, by focusing on identity politics, they were reaching out to all these groups, but reaching out with what? They didn't have a platform for everybody, right? And then say, we want to include everybody in this platform or program. That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, I think there's two facets to it. One is definitely that it's easy to get hyperfixated on, you know, let's come up with different messaging, let's come up with different approaches to each different demographic when, you know, the kind of blunt force response was, well, affordability is kind of killing all of us, right, across the board. That being said, I do think it's important to, again, recognize that there are differences in the way these things impact different groups, and there's a way to do both those things. And I also want to add that, again, to the point of, you know, is culturally progressive in contrast with economic messaging that meets the needs of working class Americans, I would note that, you know, Abigail Spanberger's opponent in Virginia made a huge push to try and attack her on trans rights. Right, that was the Republican candidate was Winsome Earl Sears. Virtually her whole campaign was trying to do that. She even ran basically a redux of Donald Trump's, you know, Democrats are for they, them ad from 2024. And Spanberger did not retreat on trans rights. Spanberger never came out and said anything that threw trans Americans under the bus, never came out and basically, stood strong and said, look, there's a way to support, even the most marginalized folks in our coalition, LGBT folks, trans folks, without losing sight of the fact that affordability is hitting all of us. And so she stayed laser focused. She didn't get pulled off the issues, but she also didn't retreat on some of these, again, what you might call culturally progressive causes that I think are still very important, right? It is important that we are a party that stands up for the civil rights and liberties of all Americans, no matter, who you are, whether you're trans, LGBT, it doesn't matter, right? We stand up for the human rights of all Americans. And I think Spanberger's campaign, to a lesser extent, Cheryl's campaign, showed that you can do that without ceding ground on speaking to the needs of working class Americans.
So how about the generational shift in leadership? Do you think we need, in fact, let me stop sharing this.
Yes. And I think this is a good point to bring in a thought that I was having when Carter spoke, and you raised the question of, the end of this shutdown, right? And my sense that, that particular thing is emblematic of a broader issue, which is generational change within the party. I think everyone knows who the leader of the Senate Democrats is, right? Yeah, spry young guy, Chuck Schumer, right? I mean, if you look at the 8 Democrats, and Angus King, who's an independent, but caucuses with Democrats, none of whom are up for re-election this coming election cycle, which tells me that either Democratic leadership worked with these folks to say, okay, who is the least vulnerable to a backlash in a primary election, or it tells me that Chuck Schumer cannot control his caucus. And I think either of those tells me that this is an example of where we do need generational change, leaders in Congress who are more attuned to not just what the party is feeling, but what the American people are feeling. Because my immediate reaction when I saw the news of the shutdown deal was, why did you blow it, right? We had, and I don't like to talk too much about media narratives because they are inherently artificial, right? But for the first time in a long time, Democrats had the media narrative, right? The media was talking about, man, those 2025 elections, Democrats did very well. What we thought was this new Republican coalition just crumbled. And then a few days later, we get, oh, Democrats caved on the shutdown. So I think that's an example of where generational leadership comes into it. I think you see that as well in the 2025 elections. Folks like Abigail Spanberger and Mikey Sherrill, who are in their early 50s, and let's not think too much about the fact that early 50s constitutes younger. And Mamdani, who I think is 34 years old now. And I think that did have a huge impact on the races themselves, right? In 2024, Harris lost young men aged 18 to 29 by 1 point. Mamdani won that demographic, men aged 18 to 29 by 40 points. By the way, I just turned 30 and I don't want to think about the fact that I'm no longer in the 18 to 29 age bracket. But, I think you don't have that outcome if you don't have a 34-year-old Democrat who is speaking to, what young people are feeling in New York City. A lot of people were talking about, oh, this is just the messaging part of it. I don't think that's the case. I think there are substantive reasons for why he won and substantive lessons from a policy perspective that Democrats should take. But part of it is also the messaging part of it. And this is also where I think, and I don't know if we want to get into abundance versus populism a little later, but this is where I also think you might see that these two things, again, are not super different, right? The abundance agenda often talks about, well, the fundamental problem is overregulation, red tape, lengthy processes where there's too many potential roadblocks. So my question is, how many folks remember the kind of Mamdani's big breakout viral video where he was talking about halalflation? Did folks see that? Yeah. And he's talking to food cart vendors in New York City, and he's saying, what's your biggest challenge? And they're saying, well, the permitting process takes so long. and it costs so much money. And as a result of that, I have to up my prices year after year to just keep up with the cost of doing business. And Mamdani, he calls it halalflation because that's catchy and it sticks in your head. But that is permitting reform, right? And so while there are substantive differences as well, I do want to make the case that, we don't have to pit abundance against, an argument for working class needs, affordability. Sometimes these things are just a question of how do you message them.
Going back to the shutdown, maybe you can address, so there's a bit of a trade-off, right? In terms of the midterms and Democratic success, essentially the worse things get for the country, the better. And so not solving the healthcare, the huge increases at the end of the year in healthcare for Obamacare is a good thing for the Democrats in that it will make things very hard for people. They'll be mad and then they'll vote for Democrats. If we solve it, then it's a gift to the Republicans and Trump. So this has been discussed a lot. I'm not just, making it up. So on the other hand, the downside is people won't have health care. They'll suffer terribly. And, we don't want that, right? Essentially, they're using our own compassion against us. But what do you think about that in terms of strategy? And maybe that's what Schumer was thinking about. Obviously, these 8 people didn't just randomly appear. And
Yeah. John Fetterman did not just like pop out of a cloud and be like, I'm going to vote to end the shutdown. Some of the warning signs have been there for a while. I think part of it, and this is something I think that more and more people are thinking about and talking about, is that for a long time, the expectation has been that, Republicans can kind of be toddlers and Democrats are going to be the adults. Republicans can go and kind of break it and shut down the government. Then Democrats are going to be responsible and say, well, we have to reopen the government because we're responsible policymakers and we're thoughtful about these things. And then next time Republicans come back and say, hey, we shut down the government again. Can you help us reopen it? But we're not going to give you anything for it. We just want you to be compassionate and thoughtful. And so I think part of it is breaking that dichotomy as well. And, when we have these things, being very blunt about going to Americans and to voters and saying, look, this is what happens when you elect Republicans. You give them the White House, you give them the House of Representatives, you give them the Senate, and they still cannot manage to govern. And I think that was the point that needed to be made. And I don't know that it was made as effectively as it should have been during the period that the shutdown was ongoing. But I think that's something that we need to keep in mind as well. Because I do think people were more receptive to that argument now than they were ever before. And I think part of the reason why it was such a blow to have these 8 Democrats vote to stop the shutdown is that argument was finally starting to get through to people.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about abundance because it isn't just housing. It's the barriers we have prevent building things from power plants, but more importantly, updating the grid, certainly transportation. A lot of the environmental climate change objectives we want are being blocked by a lot of regulations and roadblocks we have put in place. And, so that's kind of the thrust of the argument there, that we really want to see more, we want to do these things. And if you look at China, which, admittedly, they do a lot of these things by ignoring human rights there, right? So you can just, that's the advantage of an autocracy, right? You can just say, we're doing it. We don't care. But, in terms of, they practically own now the, whether it's, wind, solar, whatever those are. And it doesn't help now that we are deliberately getting out of those things in the United States, kind of handing it over to them. But they are doing it, so it can be done. But that's a big consideration. It isn't just, handing everything over to the developers so they can bulldoze everything. It is how do we achieve the objectives that we want to achieve, given our progressive values.
Yeah, so there's a few things that I want to say on that point. One is a brief diversion, but my specialty is in security policy, international relations. So that part of me just has to say, you know, we often talk about, you know, China is building so much, China is doing so much, you know, why can't we do what they're doing? It seems like they're just, you know, building high-speed rail, building housing unimpeded. Part of the reason they're able to do that is because local cities, local counties in China have been taking on ever increasing amounts of debt to finance those projects. And the chickens are coming home to roost on that front. And so they're increasingly encountering an economy that's growing more and more fragile as these localities take on more and more debt. And my sense is in the near future, that's gonna come to a crashing halt. That's my IR professor point made. I'm gonna leave that there. The other point I want to make is around this question of abundance, cutting red tape, regulation, and just for folks' awareness, you know, this is often framed as a dichotomy where, okay, on one hand, you have abundance proponents saying, look, we've got to address the regulations, this sort of labyrinth of regulations that's preventing development, preventing housing, preventing projects. We have to address these choke points where interest groups can kind of step in and block things from happening. And then the flip side to that is folks who are more inclined to say, well, actually the problem is, you know, we have this ever increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people, in the hands of wealthy individuals, massive corporations. And that's actually the reason why we're not seeing the development and the progress that we want to see. And if you look at some of the literature on this, right? So someone I'm a big fan of is Daniel Carpenter, who's one of the foremost scholars on regulatory bureaucracy. He wrote a book called Preventing Regulatory Capture. And the point he makes is, well, these regulations are not built in a vacuum, right? Someone is shaping the environment these regulations are made. And who is in the best position to shape those regulations? It's going to be who's got the most money, right? And so he makes the point that, you know, these regulatory environments are sculpted by wealthy donors, by large corporations. And so I think one of the issues we have is that these are very much interconnected, right? The regulatory is connected with the concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people. Another scholar named Francis Fukuyama talks about how when you have more concentration of wealth in the hands of an elite few, the power of the state is eroded to govern effectively, to implement policies that serve the public good. And so the issue you have is not necessarily the regulations themselves, right? You have to have regulations. Look back to the 1880s and 1890s for how things go when you don't have regulations. But the question is, who is in a position to shape those regulations, right? Who has the influence and the power to shape those regulations? Because that's who is then going to be served by those regulations. And so I think the question is not the regulations themselves, but how do we mitigate the influence of special interests that are able to shape those regulations, right? These special interests that, because they have the most resources, they're able to build long-standing relationships with policymakers. They're able to lobby more effectively for their perspective. I'm thinking in particular about, is anyone here familiar with Tyler Diep? He was a Republican Assembly member down in Orange County, who back in 2022 voted for a bill that would tighten restrictions on rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft. They then dumped millions of dollars to defeat him, and he was defeated, right? When we talk about shaping the regulatory environment, that is who has the power to shape the regulatory environment. So again, when we're talking about abundance versus populism, they're not two separate things, right? We should not fall into this trap of thinking, okay, you have to pick one or the other. They're connected. One feeds into the other, and problems over here are very much going to impact problems over here.
You're talking about the influence of big money, which is obviously enormous, and but what can we do at this point to, we need a constitutional amendment, I guess, to get rid of Citizens United to roll some of that back.
Well, I think there's actually a lot that can be done. And because we have local policymakers here, there's a lot that can be done at the local level, right? We tend to think of campaign finance reform as that's a national thing, right? But there are things that you can do at the city council level, at the county level. I used to work, I again work, but a few years ago was working at the San Jose City Council when we passed a pretty broad slate of campaign finance reform items. And that included looking at public financing of campaigns. That included a ban on foreign influenced corporations from spending money in San Jose elections. Those are things that make a difference, right? Those are things that say that, you know, fundamentally our elections should be accountable to the people who are most impacted by them, and that's the voters themselves, right? That's the people living within the jurisdiction the election is taking place. And so things like public financing help get you there. Things like curtailing the power of corporations to dump millions and millions of dollars into local elections gets you closer to that. It's also important because the local level is where big money has the most influence, right? $1 million may not make a huge difference in a Senate election or a gubernatorial election. But if you're running for Sunnyvale City Council, $1 million is going to make a big difference. And this does happen. Richmond, California. Is anyone familiar with some of the issues they've had around Chevron? Yeah. So a few years ago, Chevron decided, you know what we'd really like for Christmas is a city council. So they dumped millions of dollars into the city council elections in Chevron that year. A similar thing happened in Seattle. Fortunately, in Seattle, it didn't work. But that highlights the risk that you have, and it highlights why it's important for us not to think, well, campaign finance reform, getting money out of politics, that's a national thing, right? And as long as Republicans are in charge, or as long as Citizens United is in place, we can't do anything about it. There is a lot you can do in your local communities, in your city, in your county, to limit the influence of big money, and by virtue of that, bolster the influence of the people who are most impacted by the elections, which is the folks who are voting, the folks who are living in those cities and counties.
I don't suppose city of Santa Clara would be an example of.
You know, I don't know if I can comment on that.
But I believe Mountain View limits the amount of money you can spend in a council election, right? Yeah.
So Mountain View currently has a voluntary expenditure limit that people mostly follow. Although it's kind of interesting, last year or last cycle, I was the only one that raised up to that limit. So that might not just even be in the cards for the type of candidates that we are. It started as in 2000, it was $15,000, and it increases by 3% every year. It was last year it was around $31,500. I don't know how much people spend in Sunnyvale City Council races, but it's districted, so you probably get a little bit of reprieve there. We also have a contribution limit. If you accept the voluntary expenditure limit, you can get up to $1,000 from an individual donor. If you do not accept the voluntary expenditure limit, which never really happens, you're limited to $500 from an individual donor as well. We also have a localized disclose act, so that in IEs, because that was probably the bigger issue, if you limit the expenditures from an individual candidate, you probably will face a lot of IEs. We have a disclose act that has to list the top 3 donors to an IE in like a very clear way on each mailer. So like even if the PAC is like called Committee for Happy Puppies and Kittens, it'll say top funding by California Apartment Association or Prometheus, things like that.
Thank you. And well, we've got a couple of questions. We need somebody to be a runner with a mic, I think. Well, no, but Zoom. Even if people in the room can hear you, people on Zoom will not be able to.
It seems like that we already do have some spending limits because when Nisa was here, she indicated that she could only accept $1,000 from anybody, corporate or individual. That's for county offices. Thank you.
Yeah, well, as Councilmember Vice Mayor Ramos alluded, different jurisdictions have different laws, even within the county, right? So different cities have different approaches to campaign finance. And also, as the Vice Mayor alluded, independent expenditures become a different story, right? And there, all of a sudden, the restrictions are a lot looser. And it's also often harder to track who's giving the money in support of a candidate, in opposition to a candidate. Now, Mountain View has, again, a great system where you disclose the top 3 donors. A lot of places don't have that. So you might get a mailer, saying, hey, this candidate hates puppies and wants to vote against your interests, but it's not going to tell you who funded it, right? It's not going to tell you where it came from. And so that's part of the challenge here, is that different jurisdictions are going to have their own approach to it. And so there's still a lot of room at the local level to push for policies that amplify the voices of residents rather than big money. I think, again, public financing is a big part of that as well. Different jurisdictions have it. We're talking about the elections in New York City. New York City has a public financing system. LA does. Berkeley has one as well, Seattle, and there's different approaches you can take to that. NYC does a matching system. So if, say, a small dollar donation of $15, $20 is given, that'll be matched $15, $20 in public funds. Seattle has something really interesting called democracy vouchers, where every voter gets 2 vouchers for, I think, $20, and you can allocate those vouchers to different candidates as you see fit. And I think that's a really great approach because, again, not all of us have the money to just spend on elections, even if we care about them very much, right? $500 to me is probably very different from $500 to someone who makes a whole lot more money than a college professor does. So I think public financing is another really great step that local jurisdictions can look at when they're thinking, how can we make our elections more responsive to our residents and less responsive to big money interests?
Hi, I'm Linda Sell, and I'm Vice Mayor of Sunnyvale, but speaking in my own personal capacity. So what I noticed in Sunnyvale was that a few years ago, we switched to district elections. So before district elections for council members, you would need to fundraise to speak to all the voters in the whole city. And then we switched to district elections, where we broke the city up into 6 districts, and a council member would run in their districts. And what I noticed when that happened is that we got a lot more diversity in the council members that were elected. And it's my opinion that maybe when we switched to district elections, we lowered the threshold. So you didn't have to raise enough money to reach out to the whole city. You could raise enough to reach out to 1/6 of the city. And then that made it so people that came from different backgrounds, such as we had the first, LGBTQ male candidate, LGBT female candidate, the first female Hispanic candidate, the first Asian female candidate, so first Indian candidate. So many of those first happen. And so I think, like, when you do these things where you kind of democratize these who can run, and you don't make the threshold so high, that you make it so just more average people from different walks of life can get into city government or whatever elected office. And then you also localize it so that the people that elected those people can get access to those people better. And I think overall, all these things like in Mountain View and all the things that Alexander mentioned makes things better for our government. So I hope we can keep doing that. And I also wanted to say that, in a previous kind of election, like a Mandani winning in New York would have been unheard of. I think they said that multiple billionaires poured in money to his opponent, and like 22 million went into campaign ads against him. But then on the other hand, he was able to, I think when I would hear advertising, hundreds of thousands of people walking for him or phone banking or whatever. And I just think like when we democratize, when we get more people involved, that we just have a better government that more represents the people and does good for the average people.
I think we should mention that Mondani did a fantastic job with social media. And that's a criticism that the Democratic Party, they spend a lot of money on TV ads and even just ads, but they not very effectively using social media. And I think you only have to look at Chuck Schumer's fabulous TikTok videos to see a prime example of that. But that's maybe something we should keep in mind too.
Yeah, and I also want to add to the talk, the discussion around Mamdani's victory, because Martin did a really great breakdown of the election results and talked a bit about NYC, and I want to build on that by noting something that I think is interesting and hasn't really been appreciated, which is that Mamdani's coalition looks a lot like Trump's in a lot of ways. Mamdani drew out a lot of folks who had never voted in a mayoral election before. 15% of his voters were non-Harris voters, right, as a Democratic nominee. And some of those were folks who didn't turn out. 1 in 10 of them were Trump voters who had voted for Trump in 2024 and then went over and voted for Mamdani. They were disproportionately more likely to be non-college educated, more likely to be lower income, and about 40% of them said that they had made up their mind on who to vote for in the last couple of weeks of the election. So and this is all, data that's just coming out. I can't tell you that I have the answer on exactly what that tells us for Democratic elections moving forward, but I do think that's an interesting comparison when you look at their respective coalitions and you see that Mamdani's, despite being in many ways the complete opposite of Donald Trump in just about every way you can imagine, but the coalition that he put together resembles Trump's in a lot of ways. And I think that's something that we need to be thinking about and looking at as well as we talk about, well, what do these elections mean for the party moving forward?
Yeah, change elections or people who want to burn it all down even, that's a common element.
Hello, my name is Trent. I actually want to build off of what you said, but also kind of go back a little bit to some of the framing in the conversation that we're having. For like, Democrats are really annoying because they like go for the particulars and stuff, is a weird comment. Just for the simple fact that like, when you brought up the Mamdani video, like we don't live in New York. Most people don't live in New York. Yet we know a very specific policy or like a very specific regulation that is directly affecting a thing that like everyone can relate to, which is food. And so him presenting that information is a way to both educate people, because like saying somebody's like educated, like college educated and stuff, like I think we've met people who are like genius people, like people who can do amazing things, and then you give them like one simple task and they like break down. Education doesn't actually help if it's not focused on a particular form of education. And so Mamdani's social media presence is about like directly saying like, hey, this is an issue. This is a specific problem that I can address. Here's some cool visuals alongside that, which is just literally walking down New York Street. I think that like when you're talking about like what you were talking about earlier, like rights and stuff like that, like you or talk about demographics, you need to talk about like specific things that people actually can use. Because like I'm from Florida, or I'm Florida, Michigan. I bounce between the two. And when I was born 31 years ago, so I'm a little above you, there was a Gallup poll that said that the rate for interracial marriage being accepted was like in the acceptance for interracial marriage was in the minority. It was like 48%. And I was growing up in Florida where like I experienced that personally. I can tell a lot of stories about that. And as the years went on, I felt less of that. And a lot of that came from people literally interacting with other people by like having, like not even just messages like, don't be racist, but like literally like, hey, here's cool music. Who made that music? And like actually having a lot of like places to meet at. When you're talking about things like housing policy, the people who didn't think that interracial marriage was fine are still around. Like the civil rights movement didn't happen that long ago. When you're talking about housing policy and being so like why it's so car focused and all that stuff, like you also have to kind of discuss that like segregation was a thing and that people don't really move houses, right? And people also don't always change their mind. So like, how would you educate somebody to actually say like, hey, this big portion of land that we're using that was like part of the redlining, that was part of like all these issues, it's hurting us now. We need to make not a city a stagnant thing, but like a living place. How do you speak upon that? And like a lot of times for Democrats, it's not there. Like it just doesn't exist. Like one of the cool things I like about Mom Donnie's website and Wilson's website is that if you go to their policy page, they have like little narrative blurbs, but they will tell you like specific things that happen versus like when I was trying to get people to vote for Kamala begrudgingly, like I could point to her page and she was like, make things better. And like there are policies like specific, like these are the things that you do, but like if it's not actually like how do you use this, but like what is the government actually doing? Like what is happening? Then like you can be educated on it. Like people can know the policies, but like at what point do you say like why are we using these policies? And same thing for like Mom Donnie's deregulation. Deregulation is usually conservative because like if you deregulate things and you have a lot of like capitalists kind of like going around doing terrible stuff. But regulations are just laws. They're things to help people move along. So if you can educate people on that, then that seems like a actual strategy to go forward with. Like Mom Donnie is not just cool social media or anything like that. And it's not like, oh, are we focusing too much on identity politics? Are we doing too much educate? Like you need to go towards educated people. Like you need to integrate people by being actually like finding ways to educate them in 2 seconds. And people have like the internet, they can search afterwards too. But also like having language that is about like what needs to be done, like specifically would be a better thing. And I think Mom Donnie and even Wilson is like showed that. And I don't think you could find a Democrat that does quite the same thing. And like most people, like at least I've talked to in like different states and stuff, right? Don't want to vote for somebody because Trump is evil. Because like, sure, things are bad, but like if there's no future, then like, who cares? Low rambly, but like, main point is that like, progressivism versus abundance and like all that stuff. I feel like the slides need to be refocused towards like why, not just like, oh, we need to go for working class. We need to do abundance versus progressive. Like, what is the actual steps that would be taken? I think a better discussion.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, and that's one thing I've tried to communicate is again that these things are often pitted against each other as it's this or it's that. And you know, frankly, I think we often it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of this stuff, right? Abundance versus progressivism. When the real question is just, you know, people are looking and saying, what are you going to do, right? And I think one reason Mamdani and Spanberger were both successful and Mikey Sherrill is they answered that question of what are you going to do, right? Mamdani came out and said, hey, here are some things I'm going to do. Free buses, freeze the rent, right? Community grocery stores, because your groceries are ridiculously expensive. And I know I'm feeling that here in Sunnyvale as well. And so, you know, coming to folks, and another interesting thing he did is there's lots of clips on him just on the street going, hey, you regular New York person, what's going on in your life, right? What are you experiencing? And then he keyed the campaign towards that, right? Because person after person was like, well, what I'm going through right now is my grocery bill is insane. My rent keeps going up and I don't know how I'm going to make it through another year. And so he keyed it to that. And so talking to folks, understanding what they're experiencing and coming up with specific policy solutions that address those needs. And I think that's what Mamdani did very well. Cheryl, again, with talking about freezing increases in electricity costs and gas costs. Both of them did that, right? They not only found what voters are feeling and experiencing, but also came up with bold solutions that people actually felt spoke to their needs. And so those are kind of two things that I would point to there. Another point that you made that I think is really interesting is about how do we connect some of these policy proposals to people, right? You mentioned housing and talking about, you know, how do we make the case for things like affordable housing to folks who, you know, like, well, I bought my house 50 years ago and I've been here ever since then. I don't see the issue. And what I found is most effective when talking with folks is to say, well, what about your kids, right? Because you're doing great here, but your kids have to live in Tracy because they can't afford to live here. And look, I like Tracy just fine. I don't want to divide the room if there's anyone with strong feelings on Tracy, but you know, you want to have families that are able to live together, right, in the same communities. You want to have people who work in a community to be able to live in that community, right? You don't want teachers who have to commute 2 hours every day to get to the kids that they're teaching. And so that's kind of the way I think that we connect it with folks is we think about some of those things. And I've seen that to be successful when we're talking about housing. And I think it applies to a lot of other issues as well. But that's just kind of one example that I would point to.
Something I think Martin brought up and you brought up here is the idea that those three elections, New Jersey, Virginia, and New York, the candidates were very different. And a question of to what extent, how big a tent should we have, particularly for different regions of the country, that if we, you know, if we have a litmus test for every candidate everywhere, and Joe Manchin is a good example of somebody we all like to hate, but let's face it, out of West Virginia, we're not going to get somebody who is in line with the way we think. But he was better because he caucused with the Democrats. So to what extent should we open up our tent and allow and support candidates with divergent views under our tent?
Yeah, so that sparks two thoughts for me. One is that I think with every party, look, it's good to have a big tent, and it's good to say, obviously, different candidates running in different places are going to be speaking to different issues, right? What somebody running for Congress in Sunnyvale speaks to is going to be very different from what someone running in rural Minnesota is going to be speaking to. But that being said, I don't think that means that we shouldn't have a set of policy principles that we say, look, here's what we believe as a party, right? You know, these are the things that we stand for. These are the things that every one of our candidates can go out there and talk about. And I think absent that, you run into a problem that, frankly, I think Democrats have had, which is people going, well, okay, I know what my local congressperson stands for, but I don't know what the party stands for, right? It's all kind of this vague amorphous blob. And so I think it is important to recognize that different candidates are going to speak to different issues, but that as a party, we say, okay, here are the things that we stand for as Democrats, right? The other thing I would say is, and this is here's where I'm going to out myself, which is political analysts, college professors, they can tell you what they think. We're actually really, really bad at trying to predict what's going to happen based on that, right? We have this tendency to default to this idea that there are lasting coalitions in politics, right? And that an election has the opportunity to build a coalition that then persists for years and years and elections to come after that. And I don't think that's the case. I think every election is essentially a bringing together of voters from different camps, different walks of life, who come together in that one moment based on the events of, say, the past year, based on what they've been experiencing. It's much less often that you see these kind of lasting coalitions come out of elections. And, you know, one example I'll point to for that. So 1936, FDR, big landslide election. Does anyone know what the most Democratic state in the country was in that election? Texas, West Virginia. It was South Carolina, which FDR won, this is true, 99% of the vote in South Carolina. And, you know, the next few elections, that stays largely the same. You know, it drops a little bit, maybe down into the low 90s with shifts in events. In 1944, he won about 90% of the vote. In 1948, the Democrat in South Carolina won 24% of the vote. And so I think that illustrates this idea. Look, voter coalitions do come together sometimes, but they respond to events. And those events can very quickly destroy the coalition that you thought you could count on. I think Republicans learned that because in 2024, they came out and said, we built this amazing coalition, right? Working class voters, inroads with Latino voters and Asian American voters. We're going to kill it moving forward. This is the new Republican coalition. And then these elections in 2025 roll around, and those gains are not just rolled back, but actually even further, right? If you look at Loudoun County in Northern Virginia, this is the most, Eastern Loudoun County is the most Asian American part of Virginia. It voted by 35.5 points for Biden in 2020. That went all the way down to 22 points in 2024. And there were a lot of Republicans saying this may be a new kind of reservoir of strength for us if we can keep moving it in that direction. Spanberger won that area by 39 points. So one thing, you know, if you walk away with nothing else, walk away with this. Voter coalitions are not the durable, ongoing facts of life that we often tend to think that they are, right? They change, and they change in ways that you sometimes cannot predict. Whether you're, you know, a big fancy college professor in a poli-sci department at a university, or just someone who reads the news. That's one point I want to make. Voters respond to events. They respond to what they're experiencing. They don't tend to build durable coalitions that last into perpetuity that a party can just count on time and time again.
Yeah, we're talking about a year ago. Carter?
Yeah, so I just was thinking about this, you know, as I've been listening to folks talk and different ideas that were presented in the slides.
It's on, but put it
Okay,
closer to
there
you.
we go. Something that I find myself thinking about is the difference between winning elections and good governance and policy. And, you know, I think as Mike pointed out, there's some real advantages when there's pain in our society for the party that isn't in power, right? You're looking at, you know, presumably the calculus that Senate Democrats made when they caved on the shutdown, right? And they're like, well, you know, midterms are coming up. Maybe this is our chance when Americans are feeling pain that we can go and win the next election. And when I look at that, I can't help but feel like this is the wrong strategy for us. And part of that has to do with winning elections and governing and really making the progress that we want to see and the changes that we want to see in our society and building for the future. It doesn't happen in 4 years. It doesn't happen in 2 years, right? These are long, drawn out processes that need consistent wins, that need, you know, this sort of consistent coalition, right? That's difficult to build, as Alex pointed out. And I wonder, what are we losing by, you know, sort of compromising our values in the short term for potentially a, you know, small electoral gain in the next cycle, as opposed to looking at the big picture? And I was curious if you could speak to that a little bit. And then the other thing is, I mean, and then of course the example that I'll give is, right, we haven't had, you know, a two-term president now, right? It's been like 4 cycles, essentially, right? You know, we had Obama, and then he was a 2-term president, but a lot of the wind was taken out of his sails after the Affordable Care Act passed. And it was basically Republicans controlling, you know, the House and the Senate and blocking everything that he was trying to do after 2010. Right. And then, okay, 2016, he won. Then it was a Republican, then Biden, then a Republican. Presumably next time it's going to be a Democrat. And I just sort of look and I'm like, how are we going to go and actually move forward when it seems like we just keep going, okay, we're doing this. And then, okay, actually, we're going to go the complete other direction, 180. And I was hoping you could speak to that and, you know, maybe comment on it. Is it a transitional thing with our leadership? Is it that there's no positive vision? I tend to think it's that, right? What does the imagination look like for the Democratic Party? Because sometimes I feel like it's, let's just keep things from getting worse. And I don't think that's a very compelling message to voters. And you know, I'm sort of spitballing here, but you know, there's so many things that are flying around in my head and all these different factors. And I'm really wondering, right, how much is it that we can just sort of give voters a narrative that we're going to fight for you and you can fill in the blanks, right? Do we need to tell them every single thing that we're going to do? Or can there be some quote unquote strategic ambiguity where, you know, you trust us? It's less about the policy. It's more about who's my character as a person. Do you think that I'm going to represent you and use that? Because I think when I look at Zohran Mamdani's victory in New York City, I think that he comes across as a very genuine person that's out here listening to people, right? You know, does the policy matter as much as he's showing himself to be a person of excellent character? right? Specifically that line that he had on Cuomo, where he says, Cuomo's, bashing him for not having experience. And he says, you might have all the experience, but you have no integrity. And I have integrity that no amount of your experience can make up for. And I think that really resonates with people. So I do sort of wonder about that, about the personnel, about the vision, about the sort of transitions that occur. If you could speak to that, please.
Yeah, so let me start with the question around, offering a vision beyond, hey, let's make things not worse, which, fine, good. We don't want things to get worse. But I think what we found is that's not very compelling if you're talking to folks who are like, well, the way things were before also was not going great for me, right? Like, it's not like this affordability crisis came out of nowhere, right? We live in one of the most expensive places in the country. I know I've been feeling the rent pinch for a whole lot longer than just the last couple of years. And so, I do think, to your point, yeah, it's important that we don't just come and say, let's go back to the status quo, let's go back to normal. That worked to some extent in 2020. I don't think it was necessarily because of the argument of let's go back to normal. But I don't think it's working now, right? People are not satisfied with just hearing, well, let's go back to the status quo that we had before. Let's go back to the normal that we had before. I think people want to know, what are you actually going to do now to address some of the issues that we're having now and that we've been having for a while? And so that's kind of what I would say about this question of kind of status quo. To your point about, to what extent does, the specific policy item matter versus questions of character and personality? Again, I think the two feed into each other, right? I think when you're running for office, ideally what, the policies that you propose and the actions that you propose to take speak to your character. And I think that's a big part of why Mamdani had such appeal, right? Obviously, part of it is just that he's charismatic and likable and he has a great smile and all that stuff. But it's also that he comes out and he talks to people and says, what are you experiencing? And then he comes up with bold solutions that speak to what they've been experiencing. And he talks about, let's freeze the rent. Let's make public transportation more accessible and easier for folks to get around on. Let's, put forward these community grocery stores that are going to relieve the burden of your grocery bill every month. I think that plays a big role in the fact that people saw him and they thought, I trust this guy, right? This is someone who has integrity. I think a large part of that is because of those specific policy platforms that he brought forward. And so, I don't think you have to run for office and be like, here's like the exact percentages and, here's a map of every location of the community grocery stores that we're going to open up. But you do have to give people, number one, a policy solution that speaks to their needs. And you, number two, have to give people a sense of, well, okay, this is something that can happen, right? This is something that can make a difference in my life. And that's going to inform how they see the candidate. So do I think he'll be able to deliver on all his promises was the question. I think that is, again, I can't predict that. I think the mechanisms are there, right? It's not a question of, well, there's no way he can do it anyway, right? The question is he going to be able to build relationships with folks in Albany, which is the capital of New York, right, where the New York legislature comes together? Is he going to be able to leverage his relationship with Kathy Hochul, which is a lot better than it was a year ago, right, when she was basically saying, oh, I don't know this guy, and turn that around into an endorsement of him, and actually a fairly strong endorsement, right? So I think the question of is he going to be able to accomplish this comes down to, well, let's watch and see what he does. If you look at the folks that he's bringing in, right, in New York City, which is unique to New York City, I don't think certainly any city here has it. You have folks called deputy mayors who are appointed by the mayor. They're basically kind of his top lieutenants. And the folks that he's bringing in are a combination of very experienced folks who've worked with lawmakers in Albany, who've worked in City Hall for years and years, what you might call quote unquote establishment picks, folks who know the mechanisms, who know the levers of power. And he's bringing in folks who were with him on the campaign trail, who very divisive opinions on Mamdani in this area. But no, so I think you look at some of the moves he's making in staffing. I do think he's building an apparatus that says he's serious about this, right? He's bringing in folks who maybe, would not have been 100% aligned with him on the campaign trail, but know how to get things done in City Hall and in Albany. And so we'll see how that works for him. But I do think he's serious about it. And I do think there are pathways forward for things that he's proposing.
Yeah, I think I want to get back more to fundamentals on Democratic Party. I don't know anything about how each state Democratic Party is organized. And I understand that, I really get that it's really the candidates that are running for a specific election and what's going around that. I think that's brilliant, because FDR was totally different than Truman, that was totally different from Eisenhower, yada, yada. But what's the fundamental, and I don't, this might be too technical, but is there a Democratic Party in each state that figures out how to heck to organize that particular state for any election, irrespective if it's a local election or if it's, well, if it's a state election or if it's a federal election? If you could comment on that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, so this gets into the wonderfully arcane and labyrinthine organization of party politics in the United States, which is, we have the DNC at the national level, and then each state has a Democratic Party, and then each county has a Democratic Party below that. And each of these works ideally in concert with each other, sometimes not the most gracefully, but fun fact, by the way, some states don't have actually a Democratic Party. They have a weird localized version of it. Like in Minnesota, they have the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which is the stand-in for the Democratic Party over there. Yes, exactly. The Nonpartisan League in North Dakota, which just sort of naturally sort themselves into, well, we have a Republican Party, so the DFL is kind of the default Democratic Party, or the NPL is the default Democratic Party. To your point about specific candidates, right? Well, there's this interesting shift that I've noticed in American politics. And like Mike said, sort of, my focus has been on security studies and also democratization. I worked for a democratization nonprofit out in DC that worked in Western Asia and Central Asia. What you often see in democratic systems, especially in places like Canada or the UK, is that it's very heavily focused on the party, not so much on the candidate. And this kind of gets taken to the extreme in what are called proportional representation party list systems, where you're not even voting for a candidate, you are voting for the party, and the party has a list of folks, and depending on the percentage they get in the vote, a certain number of those folks get into office. And so there, you're not voting for the candidate, you're voting for the party. Traditionally here in the United States, it's been the complete opposite, right? Candidates were very much localized. And that's why you had candidates who are sometimes very out of step with the national party. If you look at Southern Democrats for much of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, who are extremely regressive on civil rights, in a Democratic Party that at the national level was shifting more and more towards being in favor of civil rights. That was not something you would have had, say, in Canada, right? In Canada, you break with your party on a major issue, you're not in that party anymore. And you've seen that happen a couple times up there just in the last few years. The United States is shifting actually in that direction, I think. People are voting less and less for the candidate and more for the party, right? Joe Manchin, when he, the first time he ran back in 2010, right? This is a Republican wave election, but he won by something I want to say like 55 to 60% of the vote in West Virginia, right? His most recent election victory, 2018, in a Democratic wave year was much narrower. It was about 3%. And I think that's because just, as recent as 2010, people were saying, well, I know he's got a D next to his name, but he was governor. I liked him then. He's good. Let's give Joe a chance. 2018 rolls around, and now people are saying, he's got a D next to his name. I'm not voting for a Democrat. So I think there has been that shift. We're moving away from voting for candidates and more towards voting for parties, especially at the national level, right, at federal elections.
I wanted to comment on something. So what I've noticed, like I've been involved in the Sunnyvale Democratic Club for several years, and even before that, people founded the Sunnyvale Democratic Club. Like, I don't know if Mike was one of the founders, but Sunnyvale Democratic Club, I think, is a strength in Sunnyvale. Like when I first got involved, the council, not all of them were Democrats, and there were concerns that, some did not represent a larger the people. Anyway, over the years, more and more of them have become Democrats, and the club has endorsed, like, probably most candidates that win in our local area are endorsed by the Democratic Party. And I think it's not, I think it's because, the quality of the people that are involved in this Democratic Club, the quality of the leadership that is involved, the quality of the speakers that we get for the Democratic Club is just wonderful. And I think it just builds on itself. Like when we have an organization like the Sunnyvale Democratic Club, and it gets great speakers, it has great leadership, it has great members, that just contributes to the overall betterment of our community. And I think, you know, if more communities had that kind of organizations, I think it would bode well for more of them. But I've seen that this club has done a lot of good for our community. So I just wanted to thank everybody. The leadership, I know it's a lot of work to plan these meetings and a lot of work for people to come on a Saturday, but I just think as a city council member in my personal capacity, I can see a lot of benefits from this whole ecosystem of us all coming together and for great speakers to come speak to us.
Thanks, Linda. And we're out of time. I guess we'll have to end on that very positive note. Unless, Alexander, do you have any final comments you want to make, or? All right. Well, thank you, everybody. It's a very interesting discussion, and I think we know what to do next to win in the midterm. So we solved everything. So. Right, right. All right. Well, thank you very much.